Hello, Matt. How are you?
I am very well. How are you? Good to see you
Uh,
again.
Likewise. Yeah, last time we caught up was in person in Sydney. This time I'm back in Tokyo. But thank you so much for joining us. We have I think a number of interesting parallels in your journey and your exits and mine and so forth. So really keen to explore that. I think we could maybe start with your early background with the legendary Andrew Banks. I actually had him on one of my earlier podcasts. So maybe just
Right.
talk us briefly through that time with Morgan Banks and later Talent too, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I won't draw too many comparisons with myself and the legend that Andrew is, but yeah. So I started out my career as a chartered accountant actually in Sydney and was doing public company audit and got allured by the financial opportunities in a more sales related job. So joined Morgan and Banks in Sydney way back in '97. It was primarily a team of chartered accountants back then, all turning our hand at recruiting accountants. And then 4 years later, got itchy feet and had an opportunity to move overseas. So my wife and I looked at Singapore and Hong Kong. We ended up landing in Singapore because we had a couple of young kids. And then that was the start of I guess, a 20-year journey over there.
Fantastic. And so your decision to leave Talent too, I believe, it wouldn't have been an easy one. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I guess I'll rewind a bit. So when we got to Singapore, 2001, um, just before 9/11, oddly enough. So we had a few bumps in the road in those first couple of years. We had 9/11, and then we had SARS. But sort of from 2003 all the way through to the GFC was pretty much a glory days for recruitment back then. So yes. I hate sounding like that old guy who always talks about the old, glory days and so forth, but it really was a good time. So I stayed with Morgan and Banks / Hudson in Singapore for around about 5 years, and then Andrew had another new venture that he was doing, which was Talent 2. That was around 2005, when I was around 34, 35, came and found me. And my first opportunity to take on an entrepreneurial role because I started the business for them in Singapore, but without any of the risks. So it was, it was a great starting point for me. So I worked with Andrew there for probably around about 6 years. Um, we grew Singapore. It was a race in those days, 2005, 2006. We had lots and lots of international companies coming to Singapore. We had all the big banks coming in. The market was just flying. So it was sort of really make hay while the sun shines. So it was a bit of a race. So we sort of raced up from zero to around about 50, I reckon, in Talent 2, probably within 2 to 3 years. And then I was helping with a few of the other offices. We started an office in Japan, which I started for them. And then I was also supporting on the offices in Hong Kong and then in the Middle East eventually.
Got it, got it. And so at a certain point, you decided enough of corporate life, you're going to strike out, and you created two businesses, I think, more or less at the same time, BeathChapman and also RMI. So talk us through that.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I don't know if I'd do it again in exactly that order. It was quite a lot to take on. So I did Talent 2 for probably 5 years, 5 years or so, and then I always had in the back of my mind that I was going to start a business at some point. I don't know if my reasons were right, but it's something even since I was in high school, I always thought, look, I want to be a businessman. I want to be an entrepreneur. So left. Andrew started BeathChapman. So I had a business partner, Matt Chapman. So that was a great combination. They were doing the HR recruiting. We sort of slotted in right alongside them and did non-HR. So it was a really, really good match. So So that worked, and that was my wheelhouse. That was something I knew. I'd been doing it in Singapore for a while. I had some good contacts and stuff like that. Concurrently with that, I always had in the back of my mind another thing was to start a background screening company. I like the idea of background screening. I did feel that there was an alignment between recruiting and search and staffing and screening. It's in the same value chain. You're helping the same set of customers as you go through that. So I always thought that, look, that business would sort of slot nicely in with a recruiting business. But yeah, it was a lot of pressure. Just turned 40, 3 kids in international school in Singapore, house, mortgage, and so forth. But I just felt that it was time to go all in. So we went all in. So I was working full time in BeathChapman, and we had a general manager who was running RMI for us at the same time, and they both set off on their concurrent journeys from there.
Nice. So just from a kind of time allocation point of view, how much time are you spending on BeathChapman versus RMI in the early days?
Oh, look, in the early days, it was all hands on deck for everything. We had everybody was in the one office. We were all scrambling. It was classic days. I think you remember we actually got our initial office off RGF in Singapore.
Right.
So we rented the RGF office. We all bundled in there. We were selling recruitment. We were selling background screening. We were doing everything. But my primary focus was always on EBC. Background screening wasn't really my game. I mean, I was more of a commercial leader from a background screening. So we hired experts in who helped us to grow that business. They did a fantastic job. I was sort of more in the background, sort of, supporting, helping out with the commercials and so forth.
You mentioned EBC, so this brings in the name Ethos to the BeathChapman.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Okay, so we'd been doing BeathChapman for, it was actually a relatively short time, probably 2 years or so at that point. And I got a call from an advisor in Sydney, quite mysterious to start with. He was sort of asking if I would be interested in a merger and so forth. And look, at the time, I was generally open to any sort of discussion. So I had a call with the advisor, and it turned out that the company was Ethos, who was a company who'd been around in Sydney since 2008. So they were quite a bit more mature than us. But the good news is I knew the founders of Ethos, and very, very good quality business, great humans. So we had the discussion with them, and then next minute we were off and we were merging.
When you say merging, it wasn't a complete merger of assets and people, right? And explain that structure.
Yeah. So when they first approached us, the idea was, look, if you've got 2 businesses, you've got a relatively big and established business in Australia. You've got a business in Singapore. I also had fledgling businesses in Hong Kong and Japan at the time. And the idea is, if you bring those 2 together, you've got something that's a little bit more substantial, something that may get onto an acquired radar at some point in time. But the way we structured the merger was quite interesting. We effectively merged the front office of the business. Okay. So we had BeathChapman, we had Ethos, so we brought that together. It's a big mouthful, so it ended up becoming EBC. So we merged the brands, we merged the websites, we merged the LinkedIns, and effectively our go-to-market was united. Everything was the same. And the idea was that, that gives us more credibility. That puts us in a better position in the market with customers. We can articulate that we've, got more geographical breadth and so forth. And also it helped us to attract candidates to want to come and work for us, because we were on a trajectory, we were on a growth story. So it worked quite well from that perspective. We kept the complicated, we left the complicated part out. I mean, the complicated part in mergers, as we've discussed before, is how do you bring founders together and get them to agree relative valuations for their businesses? So the way we did it with Ethos, we didn't actually have to do that. We retained our entity, our shareholding, our accounts, our financials, and they did the same. So while we had lead fees and arrangements and stuff like that we would sort of send back and forward, we largely ran our own P&Ls, which actually made it a lot better when it came to sell, because, you know, each of us lived and died by our own set of numbers in the end. And so that worked out. That worked out really well. It did mean that an acquirer had to, the Will Group effectively had to make 2 acquisitions when they went through it. So there was a little bit more work on that front. But from a complexity perspective, as a seller, it was actually a lot better for us.
Fascinating. So from the very get-go, was there always a plan and sort of weekly or monthly meetings with the advisor, the guys at Ethos, let's build the front office together, we're doing our own thing behind the scenes, at some point we're going to look for an exit? And was there a timeline put on that from sort of day one?
Yeah, so the plan was to exit. That's why we had an advisor, we had a board, and we had a relatively thorough process. So I think we're probably doing like quarterly board meetings, working on different initiatives that were actually going to help us to be a more attractive proposition to a seller at some point in time. Now, we didn't have a fixed time frame in regards to how long it's going to take, because you never know when a buyer is going to get to emerge, from the woodwork. I think for us, we probably started looking probably 18 months or so after we came together.
Okay.
There or thereabouts, yeah.
And was there a formal sales process or an auction, as some people call it, where SIMs or confidential information memorandums were sent out to prospective buyers, including the Will Group, or did they find you through some other connection directly?
No, so we were working with a sell-side advisor. And his job was to go out there and try and find some investment in us, either investment in us or an acquirer for us. So he went out and he ascertained, a number of interested parties, and we took it from there.
Can you remember, how the first meeting went with the Will Group? Was it in person in Singapore with some of their, overseas Japanese based there? Was it video call in Tokyo?
I'd started a business in Japan through a bunch of colleagues that I had. So I knew the Japanese market a little bit, but I didn't really know the Japanese business culture as much. So we had a meeting in Singapore. I think it was in a hotel. Went into a hotel meeting room. I met with their head of M&A, one of their directors, and one of their managers. And it was interesting because it was this is the Will Group. Let us tell you a little bit more about us. These are the businesses that we have. This is our plan. This is our strategy. It was like a show and tell, and then hand it over to you. Okay, tell us about this, tell us about that. So it was I sort of, being the sort of pragmatic, Westernish sort of business person, I was like, geez, I don't know if that really went well or not, because I came out the back of it and I'm like, oh, okay. And it just sort of, okay, thank you, nice to meet you, sort of, see you later. But obviously, that was part of their process. That's how they initiated it. And it's something, as very well know, working with Japanese corporates, is that there's a high level of formality and a high level of process they would like to go through. So that was the first meeting that we did have. It was a very genteel, nice, pleasant information sharing session, I would say.
Reminds me very much of the very first meeting I had with a chap called Marai-san, who ended up being the main driver for the acquisition of my old business, CDS, that we sold to Recruit Holdings way back in the day. And again, it was a very, I guess, quite informal first meeting, actually. We talked about football, we talked about recruiting. He's a big football fan, which is quite topical now with the World Cup going on. He actually went on to become chairman of the Japanese Football Association in Japan
Okay.
after he left recruiting the region. Amazing guy. So we quickly established that kind of DNA, and then I think we knew of Recruit, this huge sort of 800-pound gorilla in the Japan and Asia market. And they wanted to get into the markets outside of Japan, and we were presumably a good fit for those guys. And then we entered into, as I recall, quite a long due diligence process, and we met with a number of people up, kind of up the value chain, as it were, within the business. And the due diligence was quite thorough, but it was a kind of an off-market opportunity. Like, we had not engaged a sell-side advisor to go there. We'd had approaches, interestingly, maybe somewhat ironically, from Hudson, who made an offer for our business, which we turned down. A couple of Japanese groups that were interested as well, but Recruit, it just felt right at that particular point. How did that whole due diligence process go? Because you've got, you mentioned that the guys at Ethos, they had their separate numbers and P&Ls and two different kind of share purchase agreements.
Look, I think nothing quite prepares you for a due diligence, let alone a due diligence from a Japanese public company. I think they're certainly in a league of their own from that perspective. It was long, so it's like 4 or 5 months, sort of thing, and it's like very difficult, I think, as an owner going through that period. Fortunately, we had an advisor. So Paul, the advisor, he was doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the DD. We had lawyers who were responding, particularly when we got to the tail end with the SPA and all of that sort of stuff. But as you're going through that due diligence process, you need your own operations manager or your finance manager or something like that. It's a lot of strain on them because they're being asked to do insane amounts of work in addition to their day job. So it's very taxing, very, very taxing process.
Yeah, we felt that too. Obviously, the back office take-up in my business being in Japan, obviously we had a Japanese back office, so they were able to handle a lot of the governance and compliance and accounting stuff. I think that the challenge for us, myself and my business partner Jason, as founders, was how do we keep a lid on this? How do we allow the guys from Recruit to have a wander around our office and keep a lid on it? And how can we manage it and still keep our numbers on track? Because obviously, as you say, it's 4 or 5 months, and during that time, there's a lot of focus on whether you're hitting targets, right?
Absolutely.
May look at the last 12 months to February, but if you close a deal in July, then what you're doing in March, April, May becomes really important. So,
yeah. Look, I think that was one of the things that I was thinking before we sat down today, was that going through that process where things can sort of fall off is if you take your eyes off the numbers. And as a founder, as you know, obviously depending on how big your company is, you're usually at the front end of a lot of those numbers that are coming in. So if your day job is to stay on top of those numbers, to manage your team and all of that sort of stuff, and you're also trying to fend off doing the DD and all of that sort of stuff at night, can be incredibly taxing and stressful period.
What made you think that the Will Group would be a good fit for you guys?
Look, I really liked the chairman, Akita-san. Didn't speak much English, but we had very, very good chemistry. He was an entrepreneur. He'd started this company some 20 years earlier. He was relatively early in his sort of international expansion stage. And the Will Group is a lot smaller than somebody like Recruit. So I liked that. But the main thing, well, the other thing that I really liked was their plan for the business. Their strategy was always to be much of a portfolio of businesses. You guys are going to come in, you're EBC at the moment, you're going to stay EBC. We want you to grow as EBC. We want to support your growth as EBC. So it was very much pitched as it was going to be a hands-off sort of arrangement. Obviously, there's a lot of hands-off. You're in a public company, you've got governance, you've got finance, you've got audit, all that stuff. Yes, you know you're going to be in for that sort of thing when you're becoming part of a public company. But by and large, they're leaving the front office alone. They're leaving your business alone. We had a couple of other interested parties at the time, and I just knew that there was a UK party. It was going to turn the whole business upside down, and I didn't know. When you're going through this, you need to make sure your team is going to stay because you have an earnout. And if your team finds out straight away we're getting sold, firstly, they're going to start panicking. So you have to manage that, right, to start with. And then if you can manage that and things don't change too much, you're probably going to be okay. But if you manage that and then all of a sudden the brand changes, the database changes, this changes, that changes, I mean, you can kiss half your business goodbye.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because we sold our business. We technically sold it on Boxing Day. So I was calling up my key people all around Asia and the globe. They're on holiday, right? Christmas holidays, Japan business, but a lot of expat recruiters in the team. And the Recruit guys, we had a different mandate from you guys. Our mandate clearly was, we want to go public. We're a $10 billion business. We need you and your business partner, Jason, to get into Asia, Simon Hong Kong, Jason Singapore. Simon, you focus on M&A, building strategic alliances and partnerships and potential M&A targets in China, Southeast Asia, and India. Jason, you go to Singapore, build a business of scale, and we'll learn through that. And so, super exciting for us. But having to explain all of that to the guys and just giving them that confidence that the brand will not change for the foreseeable future. The commission structures will not change. I'm staying, Jason's staying. We're excited. There's going to be opportunities for you in the region.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. And actually, I have a live deal right now that's going on in Australia. It's a Japanese listed business looking to buy an Australian staffing business. And I think it's, what happened with EBC and what happened with my old business, CDS, is probably going to play out with this acquisition in Australia, in the sense that the founders and the business has a huge amount of autonomy, particularly on the front office side in the early years, because the Japanese guys, they don't really know how to run that business. But they, obviously, they will look at synergies, which could be cost synergies, it could be client synergies. It could be bringing in technology, AI, all sorts of different things. I think the more positive aspects of synergies. But how did you sell it to your guys? Obviously, the independent side, the front office are going to leave us alone. But just like, were they aware that there could be growth opportunities for them individually in terms of growing within EBC? How did you to sell?
Well,
sell that?
I guess there was a couple of things. So first off, that the Will Group were not into professional recruitment. They weren't into executive search the way we did it. So, they trusted our expertise in that area, and they were buying an asset that they wanted to continue to produce, and they were smart enough not to get in there and try and change too many things. I also had a lot of trust with my management team in Singapore and the broader team. So I wasn't going anywhere. We were going to be there for an earnout, which was 1.5 to 2 years. So nothing was going to change within that period of time. And then during that period of time, they're going to get to know what it's like working under a new owner. And, ultimately people are going to make their own decisions. But, I created an incentive pool for my team. for, a handful of the senior leaders who I thought were going to be integral to that earnout process, and made sure that they were, if they performed during that time, that they were also going to get something out of the earnout as it came through. So they were incentivized financially to stay around, and they were also incentivized by the nature and structure of the new business and the new potential opportunities that there would be going into the future. One other thing that I think Japanese companies do well, it sounds small, but they do hospitality very, very well. They would bring a bunch of us, they bring us to Japan, they take us around, they show us their different businesses. They take you to a geisha show, to a sumo show. They take you for fantastic dinners and stuff like that. And look, it was a bit of a novelty for some of our guys, but it was also really nice because we as a private company, we just hadn't had a lot of that sort of experience before. So they did the small things very, very well.
We had our kickoff in a sumo stadium in Tokyo. With thousands of people from the their domestic permanent recruitment business. But you're right, and we attended some amazing events all across Asia, and it was sort of China out, India in, Japan out, like a lot of different things we did. And I think my impression, and I could be wrong on this, but I think the Will Group has managed to maintain its portfolio of businesses in nearly every case, whereas for Recruit, as we talked about, you're aware of that, but just for the audience, the original plan was we will grow the permanent recruitment business across Asia, we'll get into the Americas, we'll get into Europe. That all changed when Recruit fell in love with HR technology and bought Indeed.com and Glassdoor and paid over $2 billion for those two businesses. Wow. Of course, they did acquisitions in staffing where you are right now, Channel McLeod, People Bank, and so forth. But there came a point where there was only so much they were going to do with permanent recruitment in Asia. People, there's governance, there's compliance issues. Fantastic from an IPO point of view. We had flags in every city across Asia. Yeah. It probably added tens, if not hundreds of millions to the value of the IPO. But ultimately, it's a risky asset, which has been sort of stage one was basically taking out some unprofitable offices in the region, focusing on those that are making good money, including my old business and some of the others in Asia. And secondly, selling that whole business, which they've done for not a great deal of money, but easy to hand it to another listed business in Full Cast Holdings in Japan. But Will Group, and please tell us about it. I think it sounds to me like there's a portfolio of businesses which work pretty well independently, have a lot of autonomy, and in most cases, the businesses have grown and there haven't been any particularly bad buys. I think you probably
look, touch wood. So after I sort of finished my earnout in 2019, Akita-san, gave me an opportunity to be the CEO for their business outside of Japan. And we ended up with a portfolio of 9 businesses. They had around 500 people across that portfolio, around about nearly $500 million worth of revenue in there as well. So it wasn't an insignificant, obviously not in the Recruit class, but it was still a fairly reasonable sized business that we had. Okay, so originally, coming in as a CEO for me, I thought, oh, wow, okay, there's a lot of things that we can do here. We can share this, we can share that, we can implement all of these different initiatives and everything. But the nature of a portfolio of businesses is that obviously they're not homogenous. So one idea that you may have for one is not going to work because, all of our businesses, when we had airline staffing, airline mechanics, we had, government style MSP business. So while there was perm business in there was staffing business in there was technical businesses in there was MSP businesses, there was statement of work businesses. So, and it was across, 9 different brands, sort of 4 or 5 different countries. So it was difficult to go, well, everyone's going to go on to Bullhorn, or we're all going to do this. So, we sort of had some big ideas at the start, but sort of backed off of those. Look, governance is non-negotiable. So, we're all going to be audited, and now we're all going to be audited by KPMG. Okay, probably overkill given some of our businesses aren't that big, but that's how it works in a public company. And your reporting is going to increase. You're going to have a bit more scrutiny on your numbers and stuff like that. But by and large, we left the front ends of all of the businesses alone. All of the CEOs, if I'm not wrong, I think 2 of them have retired. The rest of them are still in place. And yeah, still touch wood, still thriving. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what drove the buying decisions? Because, from an outside point of view looking in, they're pretty random, right? The different service lines, the different geographies. Was there some central plan that we're going to be as diverse in service line and geographically as we
Look, I'd
possibly?
love to say so, but I don't think so. I think at the start, when they were looking to get out of Japan, it was a little bit more putting their toe in the water.
Yeah.
Put our toe in the water with the small business, like not go too crazy, smallish businesses, Singapore, small business, Malaysia. And then they felt that, okay, we can do this PMI stuff. Well, we know how to do M&A. Let's start looking at some larger businesses. So the earlier businesses were a little bit more sort of fragmented. From when EBC came into the frame, Chapman CG, U&U, some of the later brands to join DFP, probably a little bit more sort of like white collar contract, perm, Australia, Singapore centric. So there was there's probably a little bit more commonality going forward. But yeah, I can't say that there was from the very beginning, there was a plan as to where we were going to go. Later, like now, there is a very formal plan, like only going to be buying certain sectors, certain markets where we know it's going to be able to sort of add value and continue to add value for the longer term.
Got it. And can we talk a little bit about valuation mechanics and earnout, if you can? I mean, obviously, some of this is protected under NDAs and confidentiality agreements and so forth.
Yeah.
But just in general, did the Will Group did they? I assume it was a multiple of
Mm-hmm.
EBITDA, and there's earnouts over 2-3 years. How did that all work?
Yeah, so EBITDA multiples was how we structured all of our deals based on EBITDA multiples, and earnouts anywhere between 18 months and 3 years. The earnouts typically were. We did have a period through, fortunately or unfortunately, a couple of the earnout processes fell right in the middle of COVID. So we were able to extend some of those earnouts so the vendors weren't going to get hammered by that real COVID dip period that we had in like 2020. So we had EBITDA multiples for all the businesses. We had earnouts. The other variable that you would have in there is what percentage you sell now and what percentage you sell later. The Will Group likes to take control. So that was always our approach. So we would always want to take more than 50% on the first stage. So they ranged from 50% all the way up to 70% at the first stage. The other thing that we did, which was pretty good if you were a vendor and you were sort of going through an earnout, is you could have like a blended multiple. So hypothetically, let's say I'm going to sell my first 60%, at a multiple of 5, but I'm going to be able to sell my additional 40% at a multiple, let's say between 5 and 8, depending on my performance during that earnout period. Now, that was very attractive and compelling for our founders because you had an opportunity to, it was like a kicker. You had an
Yeah.
opportunity to sort of overachieve. And we're all salespeople, so we thought, okay, this is it. And you really get you to, get the most out of people during that sort of earnout phase. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very familiar with that. I'm seeing that with a number of transactions I'm working on right now, and it does work well. I think
Yeah.
what's important is sort of agreeing up front that you have a certain amount of control of your of your profitability, and you don't have things you're not expecting. Lots of headquarter costs or other things being dumped
Yeah.
on, which can depress the EBITDA number when it comes to it. But I guess everyone wants to see growth, right? So generally
Well,
these
you've
things
got
are not.
to, yeah, you usually with the deals that we did, you agree a pro forma EBITDA, what's normalized, what's in, what's out. So there's going to
Yeah.
be no sort of surprises going forward. But look, I think an earnout is a brilliant tool, and it worked very well in all of our situations, sort of both as a buyer and as a seller. I do feel that it's the right model.
And did the founders have an opportunity to roll stock forward at the end of a 2 or 3 year period, or it was a definitive? There was a kind of a call option, which is going to be exercised. You're going to sell it. We never 100% control after that time.
Yeah, yeah. There was a definitive period. So what ended up happening after that is then what we needed to do was make sure that we knew that a founder's earnout was coming. Obviously, we want them to stay. So what we need to do, I mean, a founder's just had a fairly big windfall. Oftentimes a life-changing windfall. But we want them to stay with the business because there's more to
Sure.
do. There's a big journey to sort of continue on. So you need to work out a way to design a compensation plan for them that's actually going to make it still worth their while in sticking around in the business. And it's not just compensation, it's what you're going to get that individual to do going forward. So for me, I was lucky because there was a big job for me to be able to
Yeah.
do. But for a lot of our other founders, we brought them into sort of group discussions. We got them involved with future M&A. There's other sort of things that you can get them to do to give them a bit of interest as beyond their original portfolio company.
I think the Japanese are pretty good at that, at least in your case. So how many years did
Yeah.
you stay on post sale?
Yeah, I stayed for like 5 or 6 years post sale.
Yeah. And in my case, 10 years, right? From selling CDS. So
Yeah,
uh,
I can't imagine if it was a different company. I mean, look, who knows? But they gave me no real reason to want to go and leave. Yeah.
can I just ask one more question about the deal? So was it typically a restraint or a non-compete period that you would ask everybody to follow just to protect the businesses you're buying?
Oh, look, absolutely. So if I'm not wrong, it was probably like a minimum of 2 to 3 years
Okay.
as a non-compete. When you're looking at non-competes, sometimes they're governed by different jurisdictions, so they can be quite complicated. And this is where we would always lean on sort of our external legal partners and employment lawyers. It's something that you can't skimp on that sort of thing, particularly if you're doing M&A in places like Australia, where it's a highly regulated market and stuff like that. Yeah, so we would always have like a non-compete, and we'd always, we were using Clayton Utz here and a couple of other firms to make sure that we got that as solid as we could.
Yeah, those are. I'm just trying to figure out what market practices I'm seeing. Anything from 12 months to 3 years, so it can be quite broad, I guess.
Well, there's two different things. On one hand, you've got it's not like a traditional employment contract, right?
Mm.
So, okay, an employment contract is one thing, but you've got an SPA, right? So it sort of should be governed under a different legal framework to an employment contract. So I think that different rules and I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think different rules and regulations would be in play there.
Can I switch gears a little bit and talk about the sale of RMI business to Veremark, if I may?
Mm.
And that's super interesting to me because, as I mentioned when we met, angel investor number one or two in Dan Callahan's Veremark from the very early stages. I'm still in there as kind of Series B, but you've I think you're the latest acquisition that they've done, and many congrats to you on that. So can we talk a little bit
Well,
about how that came about?
thank you. I'm following you around, mate, I think. um, Look, that was a deal that just completed earlier this year. So I retired from my CEO job at the Will Group the end of 24, and I was an advisor to them for 25. The real goal for me in 2025 was to sort of dive deeper into RMI and work with the business because, look, it done fantastically well. We had a really big government contract, some great MNC contracts as well. And I thought, look, the Will Group's probably got as far as it's going to get. They don't really need, we're not doing that much more M&A. So let somebody else take on that, and then I'll come in and I'll try and do a little bit more work with RMI. So I'd known the guys from Veremark for sort of 4 or 5 years at this point, and sort of had discussions on and off. But they weren't in frame or anything like that when I left the Will Group and started. So sort of like midway through 25 or so, they got back in touch. And we started a process, and it's a very, very different process to selling. So on one hand, you've got a venture capital backed, fast growing Deloitte 100 rocket ship.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you've got a staid public company in Japan. So very different processes. I didn't have an advisor when we did the RMI deal. I had a legal team. But I didn't have an advisor per se, so there was no introducer or anything like that. Look, the DD was still very, very taxing, and I had a fantastic financial controller and HR head who were very, very good in terms of helping me through that process. And I think, as we were saying before, you need to share the fact that you're going through this process with your finance team or your operations team to a degree. You have to have a level of trust because you can't keep it away from them. So we did that. We worked through that process. I think the DD itself was a bit shorter than the Will Group, but it was still a good couple of months of going through DD. They were making a number of different acquisitions at the same time, so they were sort of stacking their acquisitions. I think they completed one in the UK, maybe, mid-year last year. So they needed to sort of digest that, get that sorted out, and then sort of move on to us. Screening business is very, very different to a staffing / executive search recruiting business. So they trade at different multiples. There's different dynamics in the business that you're looking for. In a screening business, you've got a big number of sort of long-term, steady clients. They're not giving you lumpy revenue, but they're consistently giving you, 20,000 a year, 30,000 a year, 200,000 a year, or something like that. But the transaction value is relatively low, so it may be like $500 a go versus in search you're $30,000 a fee or something like that. But because of the nature of the business, they do attract slightly different multiples. Now, typically in the screening business, they can often go on a revenue multiple as opposed to an EBIT multiple or a blended EBIT / revenue multiple. So the revenue multiple is somewhere maybe like 1.5 times revenue or thereabouts. This is all public information. You can go and see what companies have sort of bought and sold for, which, depending on how profitable you are, can equate to 5-6 times EBIT or something like that. So it's certainly not like selling a SaaS business or like an AMS style of business that have attracted these quite wild multiples. So,
Yes.
But it's a very steady sort of business. But with Veremark, given that I wasn't active in the business, there's a general manager in the business, there's a leadership team in the business. That team's working directly with Veremark in terms of the integration and so forth. So I'm not involved in that business going forward, obviously doing everything I can to support them and wish them all the best, but it wasn't the traditional earnout style of structure that we would have had in a more traditional staffing or recruiting business.
Thanks for sharing that, Matt. And so what does life have in store for you now? I think you've also stepped away from the Will Group finally, and obviously you've sold RMI. So what are you up to these days? I guess you're out of bed on a Monday.
I'm doing some. My next move is probably going to be into some sort of advisory work. I do still have a couple of angel investments that I've done over the years, so I'll continue that. I'll continue with those, and perhaps look at doing a couple of other investments, and then at the same time, looking to work with. I've got a couple of potential opportunities on the go at the moment, working with sort of medium-sized companies with founders, not just in recruitment, but in payroll and EOR and other sorts of market spaces that I feel that I can add some expertise in, or add some value to them in. And yeah, that's probably going to be the next phase of the journey for me.
I'm sure our paths will cross many times in the years to come, given the connections we have in common and the sort of business interests that we have, particularly mine in M&A these days. But if I could just ask you maybe one final question. Let's go back to nuts and bolts recruitment. If you were building BeathChapman again today, if you're building a recruitment business, it doesn't have to be BeathChapman, but you're building a recruitment business today with the goal of selling it within, say, 5 years, like, how would you do that? What would you do differently?
Okay. Well, look, there's a lot of things I'd do differently, because we invariably make tons and tons of mistakes along the way. But if I was starting now in this market, I think the things that you need to be very mindful of is just picking where you're going to play. What market am I going to go after, as in what geography, what segment, what levels, and so on and so forth. So I'd be really deliberate about that in terms of where I was going to play, and I would, wherever I could, I would 100% make sure I had a contract business which was at least equal to my permanent business. Okay, and that would be there from day one. Right? Don't make your contract business an afterthought. Okay. The second thing I would do is think about governance very early on. I think a lot of time people leave corporate and think, I want to do things quickly. I want to do my own thing. I want to be my own boss. Yes, I think it's good to be agile, but you gotta have good governance, even if it's a smallish business, particularly if you want to sell one day, because this is what's going to happen. If you go through these 5 years, you're going to be sitting down in a room across from an Ikeda-san, you're going to be sitting across from somebody from Deloitte, and then you're going to be sitting across from, somebody from, a high-profile law firm. You're going to be going through your numbers, and you're going to be having to explain why, your wife's car wasn't a business expense, or why all of these personal dinners weren't, should be taken out, and all this sort of stuff. So just don't mix business and pleasure. Just keep them apart. It doesn't take a lot of discipline to do that. So get a good accountant, make them be pretty tough on you, and, do things properly, from the start. And then the final thing is, two more things. Get the right people to work with. So you want to have, I think, a good co-founder. I do feel that, being a founder, being an entrepreneur is a very lonely existence. If you've got somebody who you're in it together with, I do feel that it is going to make it easier for you. You're probably going to have an argument at some point in time. So make sure you get your shareholders agreement crystal clear, get that all squared away and sorted out. And then just the final thing is, like I said before, think about mergers. If you want to get to where you want to get to, let's say, 5 million EBITDA or whatever it is in 5 years from now, think about finding similar companies, maybe complementary geographies, complementary sectors or something like that, and consider merging to sort of get yourself to that, target a little bit more quickly. So I'll caveat that is all if you want to sell within 5 years. Okay. So I'm assuming that this is the direction that the founders and entrepreneurs want to go in. That's not the only path, as we both know. There's lots of other things that we can do. And I do feel that there's great partnership business models. There's great lifestyle business models. And we can run these things just to earn ourselves a great living and have a good, a good life and save money and so forth. But if I was particularly setting out to sell, they would be the things that I would look at.
What about offshoring and AI? So, more sort of asset light in terms of people because of those two things. What's your views on that?
Look, I think if we're just talking about recruitment and search and staffing, I do feel that, look, it's a people business and we make money by talking to people. I don't think you're going to AI yourself into being a unicorn or anything like that. I do feel that you should have good technology, whether it's a bullhorn or a similar sort of stack. You're probably going to get pretty good AI tools and capabilities from the general recruitment stack that you have in place. So invest in that, have that there, use it, but don't think that that's going to, turn you into some sort of a unicorn or something like that. I think that's going to help you to be able to compete. And I also think it's going to help you to get your people doing more of what they're good at and doing more of what we get paid to do. And that's the real pointy end, right? Not sitting there and scrolling away on LinkedIn trying to find candidates. I mean, we should be talking to people. That's our job. And offshoring is great. I do feel that, if you can leverage and you can utilize talent in other markets, in India or the Philippines or wherever, by all means do it. But look, the one warning that I would give on that, particularly these days, and you've probably seen it, there's been some legal cases in Australia, whereas, be careful with offshore employees, because sometimes they can be deemed to be employees in Australia and they can be governed under sort of Australian employment conditions. So you need to be very careful. So look, use an employer of record or a company and get that, really bolted down, neat and tidy, and make sure you're doing this to save yourself money and be more efficient and be more agile. Don't actually create a problem for yourself at the end of the day, by not doing it appropriately.
Matt, thank you very much. The hour has absolutely flown by. We could spend a lot more time talking. Really looking forward to seeing you again in the region. And thank you for sharing, so much with us today, particularly I think your summary at the end, for people who at some point are thinking to, like you did and like I did, to leave a more established business and step out. Really good foundational advice for success. So good luck with everything you do in the advisory world, and let's keep in contact. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Simon. Keep in touch, mate. See you later.
Cheers.